Hello, hello.
Hi.
Hey, Peter.
Hi.
Okay, welcome everybody to the last afternoon of the conference talks. When we looked at the conference program and saw there was a huge diversity of work, but we kind of missed the focus somewhat on the effects of sound, particularly in the marine environment. And so about 4 weeks ago, I contacted Peter, and he very kindly said he would provide this talk for us today. So I thought to myself, who is the best person to present on this? And Peter was top of the list, and he said yes. So thank you so much for presenting today. Your talk has changed slightly, so it was effects on marine mammals of underwater sound from human activities. We've now spread out a little bit to marine animals as a whole, and I understand that Peter will as well bring in some case studies from around Africa. And it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Peter Tajak and to welcome him to this beautiful arena. So thank you, Peter, and off you go.
Thank you so much. I wish I were able to be there and have heard so many of the wonderful talks. I noticed that there's a real richness of terrestrial bioacoustics. I would like to point out that even though I will only be talking about underwater, these issues of effects of sound are just as important for terrestrial organisms as well. And I did decide, because my own work is on marine mammals, and I will focus case studies on that, but I did want to at least mention a bit about fish and invertebrates, because the effects of sound are quite important on them. So I will include a little bit, particularly in the beginning, about those species. I would like to ask people to interrupt me if you have questions or comments. I don't think I'll be able to see the chat, so I would encourage people to have it by voice through the group in the room there. So basically, when we think about sound, it's just a physical phenomenon. It's when you put in a hydrophone in the water, you would get a plot of frequency against time, like in the center top, or just loudness against time in the middle of this column. That's just an electrical signal that you can get from the compression and rarefaction of the medium that's produced by sound. But when we think about the effects of sound, it's really important to focus on the listener. And there are a lot of other factors about the environment and the context that are important. And I will be going back and forth in the talk between trying to give simplifications of looking at the impact of sound as a physical parameter, but also trying to take context into account. So if we start with this point about what is sound, if you think about a loudspeaker on the left of this figure vibrating back and forth, as it pushes out, it pushes a bunch of particles in the air or in the water towards the right. And then there's a wave of this compression that moves along. You can see the black sign saying wave. The individual particles just go back and forth. They don't move themselves. And what birds and mammals detect from sound is the pressure generated by the acoustic signal. And the pressure you can think of as the density of those black dots. But fish, and most fish and invertebrates detect this particle displacement, the movement of the particle back and forth. And I'll just briefly describe why that's important. But if we look here, see the little fish? That little fish has to be small enough that it is moved by the particles. If the wavelength of both of the compression and the rarefaction are there's several cycles with the fish, it won't move. Now, how do fish and invertebrates here? I'll give the simplest example is the fish. As that animal moves back and forth in the sound field, there is a mass called an otolith in the fish, or a staticist in invertebrates. It gives an inertial force. So imagine this mass sitting on hair cells. As the hair cells move, it generates a shear force against that mass, and that's what the fish is detecting. These actually are directionally sensitive, these hair cells. So a fish by itself with one sensor can actually tell what direction the sound is coming from. That's in some ways more sophisticated than what mammals and birds do. And here's just a beautiful photograph of a dissected fish inner ear. You can see this big mass sitting within this fluid structure. So if you measure the hearing of fish, we often, as mammals, are so focused on pressure, we typically plot the sensitivity of an animal on the upper right in terms of decibels, a pressure standard. So this is a pressure sensor, but actually what we should be measuring for fish is particle acceleration, which is on the bottom right. And the best way to measure this, you actually, if you want a calibrated measurement of how fish hear, you want to have them sitting in an animal container where they can be shaken, move slightly, tiny little bits back and forth in a particular direction, and you measure the sensitivity from that actual acceleration movement. Now let's go into the real environment. And one of the things that's amazing to me looking at the fish and invertebrate work is the sophisticated ways in which fish and invertebrates use sound. And an important task that a coral reef organism has to do is where to settle. So a coral reef fish will spawn, the eggs will hatch, and the larvae will just disperse into the seawater. Once the larva gets mature enough to settle, it needs to use information to decide where the best place to settle will be. And it turns out they use sound. And this is an example of a wonderful experiment playing either low frequency sound, which would be dominated by other fish, or high frequency sound, which would be dominated by invertebrates. And the idea would be if a fish wants to settle in a good coral reef, you'd want to have a lot of those invertebrate sounds that would say that's it's a good reef area. And here are playback experiments in this experiment with a bunch of different families of coral reef fish. The black bars mark the high frequency playback, gray bars mark the low frequency playback, and the white is control. More of each of these families settled where you played back the high frequency sound, indicating a high density of invertebrates. And in fact, in some families, you even had fewer fish settling where there were high densities of fish sounds, like it might be competition. So this is quite a sophisticated response on the part of a little larva, but it turns out that even coral larvae are attracted to reef sound. And here is a cool experiment where the coral larvae were put in a transparent plexiglass tube, and speakers played back sounds of reef sounds. And then they measured how far away after the playback the coral larvae were from the sound source. And if you look at the responses of the proportions of fish, they moved towards the reef sound. If you also play boat noise, you can see that the coral reef larvae tended to move near the source of the sound in control settings when there was just reef sound on the left of the plot here on the left. If you added boat noise, you got fewer near, very few in the middle, and some actually far. Yeah. Yes? Did somebody have a question? Okay, I'll continue. And with white noise, there was less of a response. So this is, to me, an amazing response showing how you get responses of coral reef organisms, in this case, coral reef fish, to the playback of sounds in addition to the generic reef noises. Okay, so I mentioned that invertebrates like lobsters and fish, because of the mechanism of their hearing, are limited to low frequencies, low enough that the wavelength is larger than the fish size itself. Because mammals and birds have a different kind of hearing, they're able to hear much higher frequencies. And so here is a plot of the minimum sound pressure level that these different species can hear in a decibel terms on the y-axis against frequency from 10 hertz up to 100 kilohertz. And for reference for humans, we tend to hear about 20 hertz up to maybe about 20 kilohertz. Baleen whales produce very low frequency signals. I will be talking about their signals. One of the uncertainties we have in effects of noise is we have no idea how sensitive baleen whales actually are and what the frequency ranges are in which they can hear. There's an ongoing experiment actually this summer doing playback, doing audiometric research for minke whales in Norway. Once we started listening to sounds in the ocean, it was really clear that there's a huge diversity. The natural, these are all plots of the source levels, the levels of a sound near the source of natural sounds, earthquake, lightning, sounds of sort of inorganic sounds in the ocean, and then biological sounds like whales, snapping, shrimp. And the ocean is full of quite loud sounds. But over the past century, when you look at sounds of human activities, they step on the frequency range and intensities of the natural sounds in the ocean. So they have modified the global ocean soundscape by adding noise. And the question that we're really evaluating here is, what is the impact of these additions? I'm going to break into looking at individual sources and short-term playbacks, but I will also be emphasizing we want the long-term perspective as well. What about the different kinds of effects of sound on wildlife? There are physiological effects of sound. There's a stress response. Noise, if it's loud enough, can reduce the sensitivity of hearing. As those of you who've gone on an airplane or a very loud music concert may notice, you don't hear as well. This is something that isn't necessarily painful, so you may have reduced sensitivity even without noticing it. And if it gets really loud, you can have injury or acoustic trauma. There are potentially lethally physiological effects of sound, but I will be discussing a lethal behavioral effect of sound. The typical behavioral effects we think about are habitat usage, time budget, changes in time budgets, or changes in the vigilance an animal might have for other threats like predators. And it's also important to keep in mind that these changes in behavior and physiology can interact with each other. They can combine to affect energetics and health of an animal over their whole lifespan. And the effects on populations are driven by changes that affect growth, survival, and reproduction. So again, in order to understand the causation, how sound causes effects, we'll look at short-term effects of individual sounds on individual animals. But we always need to keep in mind the bigger picture and how to understand that. So what about physiological effects short of injury, stress, or effects on metabolic rate? I'll give a fascinating example that's sort of like a quasi-experiment. This is not something people did intentionally and planned, but they're observing the effects of something that happened in the world. After 9/11 in 2001, the shipping noise in the Gulf of Maine off the east coast of the US decreased. So 2 noise measurements from late August in 2001 are in green and blue. They're quite a bit higher in this low frequency region of 50 to 100 hertz. And after 9/11, these are recordings in red from September 12th and September 13th, you can see the low frequency noise dropped off because shipping pretty much stopped in that area. Now the question is, what about, could that have had an impact on the whales? It turned out that actually shipping was reduced for most of the month of September after 9/11 in 2001. And it turned out that there was a group from the New England Aquarium measuring stress hormones in right whales. And if you look at the left plot, it shows the actual box plots of the measurements of fecal glucocorticoids or stress hormones from individual whales. It's a little hard to interpret, but the basic point is in 2001, after 9/11 in white on the right of that left side plot, you see that there are lower levels of fecal glucocorticoids, but in every other later year from 2002 to 2005, as these whales were finishing their feeding season and preparing to migrate south for their breeding season, you got an increase. So the seasonal pattern would be a typical increase in glucocorticoids. But 9/11, which was extremely stressful for humans, looks like it gave a blessed quiet ocean to the right whales, which led to a measurable impact in their stress hormones. There's been a similar study on the effects of COVID on Antarctic humpback whales, and they made measurements of stress hormones in 2019 and 2020 on humpback whales feeding in the Antarctic. During 2019 and 2020, in this environment, there were 360 to 400 voyages. So there was a lot of shipping traffic in that feeding environment. In 2021, there were only 2 voyages because COVID canceled most of those trips, and there was a significant lowering in the stress hormones for those animals. So here is a sort of population level view where we can look at changes, but it is observational, and we can't be absolutely sure that the noise itself was the factor that reduced the stress. And in order to test causation, we need to also do experiments. These experiments are very difficult to do with whales, but there's been beautiful work with invertebrates. And I would like to emphasize that there has not been enough of this kind of acoustic experimentation with small invertebrates and fish that can be kept in aquaria or controlled settings. It's very important, and has led to surprises about more sophisticated effects than I would have expected, at least. It turns out that normal aquaria are very loud. The rooms within an aquarium have pumps, and they have air moving around. They're quite loud. But if you put an aquarium in a soundproof box, you can make it quite a bit quieter. And 2 French biologists in around 1980 decided to look at the impact of quieting their lab aquaria and see what effect that might have on a shrimp called Crangon crangon. And what they found was that if you compare the metabolic rates of the shrimp in the quiet box marked control compared to the experimental box, which was just the normal noisy environment, you can see there was an elevated metabolic rate, that this noise caused the animals to use more energy throughout these days. And a 30 dB increase in noise in those aquaria led to a 15% increase in metabolism. And that increase led to significant reductions in growth and reproduction because the animals had to use that energy for just everyday maintenance, and there was less available for growth and reproduction. And energetics has turned out to be a very important way to look at long-term impacts, to link short-term impacts where you can prove causation to long-term impacts on the growth and reproduction of individuals. One of the take-home messages of what we've just discussed is that testing effects of noise may require making quieter soundscapes to test for improvement. And it leads to a priority for estimating historical trends and future projections of noise. We may often, in many of our marine environments, and terrestrial environments for that matter, be already imposing a relatively high cost on wildlife, so that adding noise may not show much more of a negative impact. In those cases, you need to reduce noise and see how much better things get. And I want to emphasize this before I go into playback experiments. Most of my career has involved adding noise to the current ambient without awareness of this point that we need to also study the impact of reductions of noise. And one of a broad scale kind of study you might want on an ecosystem level to study the chronic effects of noise on marine ecosystems would be to say, take advantage of situations maybe where a shipping lane changes and you move the sound source from one shipping lane at site 1 so that you get a reduction of noise there over time to a new site, site 2. And ideally you choose a control site which had other environmental factors similar, but no change in the sound level. And this provides a way to be able to really track changes across ecosystems as you get these changes. And again, there are very few of these studies. It would be very important and useful to be able to add these as different areas propose modifications. So good pre-change studies of all three ecosystems when a harbor is being developed or when shipping lanes are changes would be very useful for understanding these broad scale impacts. This has not happened yet in many sites. Rather, there have been general studies on typical kinds of effects of noise and trying to infer what might happen or do experiments to test what happens. And the model people have used is a zone of noise influence. And the idea here is if you're very close to an intense source, you might be injured. A little further away, you might get hearing loss. Further out, avoidance. Even further, some other kind of behavioral disturbance. And the furthest away would be masking. And that could occur whenever the sound level of the signal you're looking for is, sorry, this says above, below the ambient noise level. So if the ambient noise raises high enough that it masks the sound, the animal may not be able to hear it. And this has been studied in low frequency baleen whales. And I just want to emphasize the spatial scales in the ocean at low frequencies are much broader than we think of intuitively as terrestrial mammals. So for at least 50 years, ocean acousticians have known that the average ambient noise in the ocean, this is the level of noise in the dB on the y-axis against frequency again on the x-axis, is dominated by the straight line on the left by just movement of the planet, very low frequency sounds like earthquakes. And on the right side, the noise is dominated by wind and waves. So those four curves there are different wind speeds and different sea states, breaking waves, bubbles from the waves. The higher the sea state, the higher the noise from that. You're probably quite familiar with that effect. But down there around 20 hertz, the thing that dominates the noise now is shipping. And if you think about the pre-industrial ocean, there was a little notch there, a little low noise area around 20 hertz, where the ocean was very quiet and where fin and blue whales put their calls to take advantage of low noise, and that enabled long-range communication. So it raises the question, how much did that elevation of shipping noise affect the range over which the call of a finback whale can be detected? Looking at the noise, thinking about effects of shipping was the first effect of noise on a marine animal I'm aware that had been looked at. It was looked at by Roger Payne, a whale biologist, and Doug Webb, an ocean acoustician. So these 20 hertz pulses of finbacks typically are thought to have a source level or a loudness, if you measured it at 1 meter, of 180 decibels. And in sound propagation, you typically get very long ranges of low frequency sound where the sound isn't absorbed chemically by passage through the water. And you mainly think about how it spreads. So a 180 dB signal up there at 1 meter or 0.001 kilometers, it spreads in all three directions out to about a kilometer. And that shows a steeper loss because of this spreading as it's diluted as it goes over area. But the sound then in deep ocean can concentrate at an axis of sound spreading so that you get much less loss and a shallower slope after about a kilometer. And if you now add the 20 dB of noise from shipping that I showed you in that noise plot, that would suggest that a call of a finback or blue whale, which could have reached 1,000 kilometers in the pre-industrial ocean, now might be limited to 10 kilometers. These sounds are thought to be reproductive advertisement sounds produced by males, and it raised the alarm in the early 70s that shipping noise might affect the reproductive system, lowering the reproductive rate of a population that had already been decimated by whaling. And this was a double whammy then, because if finback whales had only a few percent of the original population, and they dispersed over temperate and tropical oceans, then they would have greater separations at the same time that the range of the signal had dropped so much. This was the first alarm about the impact of noise. And I have to say, I was a graduate student around this time, and I was very skeptical about the idea that whales could communicate 1,000 kilometers or that it would be functional and meaningful for them. Here's another example of one of these low frequency calls of blue whales. I showed the example of the finback whale before. Here's a call that lasts 10 to 20 seconds, very low frequency. Both of these signals really look like they're designed for long range communication. And I mentioned I've been skeptical about the calculations of the range of detection based upon understanding of how sound propagates in the ocean. It wasn't until the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War became less intense that the navies of the world showed a little bit more what their capacities were. And the US Navy had a set of low frequency hydrophones scattered about the Northern Hemisphere. And they had used it to track Russian submarines. But when the Russian submarines weren't there, they started using it for tracking whales. And Chris Clark of Cornell University worked with them to give an example of a track of a blue whale tracked for 43 days as it swam more than 1,700 kilometers. And this all of a sudden changed my perspective. I had flown to an island where whales might concentrate or studied a feeding area, and my perspective was only tens of kilometers. But actually, many baleen whale species migrate thousands of kilometers during the year. This is a case of an animal that traveled enormous distances over this time period, not just the seasonal migration. And it was quite clear to me that its behavior might very well be affected by hearing a whale quite far away. So this, again, emphasized my concern about the impact of shipping noise on reducing the range of communication. Here's just another example of the sort of shocking ease with which the low frequency sounds can travel over long distances. On the left, top left, is a blue whale recorded at 32 kilometers. And on the bottom left is the same calls of the same blue whale recorded more than 1,000 kilometers away. This is very frequency dependent. So at a different frequency scale, on the right hand, which goes up to a kilohertz, not 20 hertz, is a humpback recorded at 800 meters versus 32 kilometers. And you can see that you already lose a lot of the information, the high frequency information in humpback song out at a few tens of kilometers. Now, the concern about the impact of masking has continued to be modeled and has raised a lot of alarms, but it must take into account the fact that whales compensate for anthropogenic noise. And this is something that is true for all birds and mammals that have been studied, terrestrial as well as marine. All of the ones that have been studied have been shown to increase their source level as a function of increase in noise. So this would be like if you're in a loud party, you'd be likely to talk louder. It's called the Lombard effect for humans. This has been shown for right whales responding to shipping noise. But again, I should emphasize it's been shown for all terrestrial birds and mammals tested. If the noise is narrow band in frequency, an animal can shift the call frequency out of the noise band. I'll give an example of that. But it can also increase the length of calls and increase the redundancy of calls to repeat it in case the noise rises and falls. So the key would be to be able to get your message through when there's less noise than when there's more noise, if the noise changes over time. So here is a plot of the noise, average noise from heavy to moderate to heavy. The dark black marks on the bottom one is moderate, the top one is heavy noise from that plot I showed earlier, and actual measurements from the west coast of the US in the Northeast Pacific from the 1960s and around 2000. Whether you have this change in density of shipping or over time, just because shipping has gotten more intense, at some point, the noise may be so loud at the frequency, at the low frequency region the whale is calling, rather than shouting louder, it may be easier, take less energy, and be easier to shift the frequency of the call out of the noise band. So in this case, if the call is being stepped on by low frequency noise, it would shift its frequency higher. And Susan Parks analyzed data of calls of right whales from the South Atlantic in 1977 in a low noise environment versus 2000, and 1956 versus 2000 in the northern hemisphere, North Atlantic. And in both cases, the populations pretty much shifted from being basses to being tenors. This is quite a significant shift in the start frequency and average frequency over time. And the southern hemisphere had less shipping noise in the Atlantic than the North Atlantic. And so that was a significant difference as well. So this suggests that not just the loudness, but the frequency ranges of calls are a function of noise. And it means if you're going to try to describe the acoustic characteristics of your species, you better document the noise as well, because part of the characteristics you record may be driven by the ambient noise. So there was the first work, was sort of initially theoretical work on the impact of masking. And the sound is audible whenever the sound level is above the ambient noise is the assumption here. Particularly that's important for baleen whales because, as I mentioned, we don't know their hearing sensitivity. And I'll now jump down into the closest ranges to discuss experimental studies of injury and hearing loss. Now, if you're working with the marine mammals, the last thing you want to do is to injure your subject. And so the way people went about studying the potential effects of noise for injury is to study temporary hearing loss. This is the kind of thing, as I mentioned, that we all experience when we're in a noisy environment, like a rock concert or even just flying in an airplane without hearing protection. It's a measurable change. And the policy assumption here is that it's a signpost, a safe signpost beyond which, if you're exposed to louder, longer times of sound, you may have injury develop. And so there was a big effort in the 1990s with marine mammals to measure this temporary shift in the hearing sensitivity. And here's an example from dolphins in the lab. You put suction cup electrodes over the brain of the dolphin, the brain stem. So the white suction cup on top is over the brain stem. The black suction cup is a reference electrode, and you measure the voltage difference across those. And if you look at on the lower left, you should see a jaw phone on the lower jaw of the dolphin. That's playing a sound. And if you look at the graph below the picture of the dolphin, the magenta sine wave on the bottom is the sound being played to the dolphin. And the blue mark is that voltage difference between those two electrodes. And as you reduce the sound intensity, you can measure when the brain stops registering the sound. So this is a very rapid, very efficient way to measure change. So the way you do the experiment is you measure the animal sensitivity like this, you expose it to a sound, and immediately afterwards you measure their hearing sensitivity again. And if you look at a summary of all these kinds of experiments, there is a relationship between the duration of the loud noise on the x-axis and the peak pressure. So the longer the sound, the lower level it needs to cause the impact. This has also been studied in humans extensively. People measure the average dose over a workday to try to get an idea of the risk of hearing loss in humans. And at the very shortest sounds, 10 milliseconds, all the marks in greens were exposures that didn't cause an impact. It took a level of 220 decibels in order to get a slight loss in hearing at this very low level. And these experiments have set the policy for most nations on what are the safe exposure levels in terms of risk of injury versus what are the levels above which you might have a danger of injury. The regulators were breathing a sigh of relief for marine mammals when they got this data, when in the late 1990s, a completely unexpected lethal effect of sound came up. This was a mass strandings of beaked whales coincident with sonar exercises. A Greek biologist named Alexandros Francis analyzed this very unusual stranding of beaked whales on a beach, a set of beaches in a bay of Greece, on the west coast of Greece. And he noted that there were more than a dozen whales that stranded over many tens of kilometers within a few hours. And the only cause that made sense was a sonar exercise, which in the morning at 0600 to about 0800 ran along the track 9 here. Then it ran in towards shore around noon and ran away from shore in the evening. And during that day, a lot of these whales hit the beach and died. So this raised a new concern that maybe sound may trigger a behavioral response that's lethal. And the levels at which, if we go back to this figure, the signals were about 1 second in duration. That would have suggested the level had to be about 200 dB to pose an impact. Well, that would be tens of meters away from the sonar ship. The odds that that ship ran within tens of meters of all those whales is very low. So it suggests that there's something going on that we didn't understand that poses a lethal risk at lower levels. And this posed a real problem to those of us who are concerned about effects of noise. Beaked whales are the second most speciose group of whales. New species are being discovered every decade. They're seldom sighted at sea. How could we study them, especially the risk of stranding? Because again, you clearly didn't want to pose a risk of harming the animals. And the first thing that we did was use an acoustic recording tag called the D-tag that we had developed to study animals when they weren't visible, just to get an idea of the normal behavior of beaked whales. And we also developed a way to do the study in a naval range off the coast of the Bahamas in the tongue of the ocean, a deep basin, in which the US and UK navies had planted almost 100 hydrophones that covered a 600 square mile area so that you could be able to record very precisely. And while we were trying to understand the behavior of beaked whales through tagging, a group there at this range developed an understanding of the sounds we were hearing from beaked whales and developed a detector for them. So here's an example of a map of this array, and the red 88 marks a hydrophone that's detecting a lot of the clicks that we think are produced by beaked whales in this area. And in order to test how well this was working, when we got these kinds of signals, so regular clicks, low frequency cutoff at about 24 kilohertz, produced a couple a second, we would then send biologists out to that hydrophone, and they would, when the clicking stopped, a few minutes later, we would identify beaked whales at the surface when the weather was super calm. So this clearly showed that we were able to track beaked whales in this area and consider playback experiments to one set of subjects, knowing that others wouldn't be unexpectedly exposed to sound. So the way we then studied this was we would tag a beaked whale on the range with the acoustic recording tag, and we would get a normal dive. So here's a beaked whale on the left diving to about 1 kilometer deep. It does a series of what we consider shallow dives for a beaked whale. But notice the second shallow dive is already to 500 meters, not shallow to most animals. And then those red asterisks mark exposure to a sonar signal starting at a very low level. And we would slowly increase the level of sound until the people listening on that array of hydrophones heard the whale stop clicking, and then we would stop the playback. And then you'd observe the behavior of the animal after the sound had stopped. After this sonar playback, the animal did a pretty normal inter-deep dive interval. We then did as a control a playback of killer whale sounds, and notice how there's a very long inter-deep dive interval after that. The other thing that happened was that when you see the little shoulder in the ascent of the dive, that was a break of it. And I'll just give you an example. This is a recording from a beaked whale echolocating using slow clicks, speeding up into a buzz to catch a prey item, and then what it sounded like and what it did as the sonar. Wait, so this is the echolocation click. Buzz, it's trying to catch a prey item. This is a moderate exposure level of that sonar sound. The animal did do a brief pause, but then it started clicking and immediately did another buzz trying to capture prey. We would not have considered this a response. The first response we got was a cessation of vocalization. So typically on a pre-exposure dive, as you would see on the top of these two plots, the animals would be feeding for about half an hour, something like that, at the bottom of a U-shaped dive. When we did playback, so we look at that sonar playback on the middle left, as you increased the level of the sound from those red asterisks, at one point the animal stopped clicking, then ascended to about 500 meters and stopped. We would associate the start of the response at the cessation of the foraging. And it did it even earlier for the killer whale signal. There was some concern that the sonar signal sounded more like killer whales than you might have expected, and that might be that the animals might be interpreting the sonar as a killer whale. So a pseudo-random noise signal, which sounded just like white noise, was developed, but that yielded on the lower right very similar responses to the sonar itself. When just a smallest sample size, we did as few playbacks of this sort as possible in order to identify what the animals did. They stopped clicking, they did very slow ascents, and all of the bolded parameters you see on the left side yielded significant differences in the playbacks. And on the right, you can see there were such outliers in slow ascent rates, fewer foraging buzzes, a lower echolocation click duration, and longer ascent durations, that we were able to get quite significant results without having to expose that many animals to new playbacks. One of the other things that was quite clear, this is a map of the patterns in gray of most of the control beaked whales. They typically sort of patrol of an area about 5 to 10 kilometers. When we did tag the animal with the sonar and killer whale playback, green marks a normal foraging dive before playback. The blue marks the pattern of the animal during the sonar exposure. Halfway through its foraging dive, it did head north, which is the only way out of tongue of the ocean. And as soon as the animal responded to the killer whale playback, it moved 20 kilometers over 10 hours as an avoidance response, leaving tongue of the ocean. Quite a bit stronger response to killer whales than to the sonar. But in general, avoidance responses look like they do both vertical and horizontal avoidance responses over short-term dive-by-dive periods and over a much longer term for horizontal avoidance. That pattern allowed us then to work with the people on the range to try to measure the vocal responses of whales before, during, and after actual sonar training exercises. So we used our experiments where we exposed animals to as faint a sound as possible to define the responses, and then we worked out a way to monitor those responses to the ongoing activities on the range. So every red circled hydrophone on the left shows that beaked tails were detected at every hydrophone basically before the exercise happened. The exercise then in the middle happened in the middle of the range. And what happened was there were no dives detected during that exercise within about 10 kilometers of the exercise. And the day after, the animals started coming back. And here's an example of the average number of clicking dives recorded per hour before sonar. You can see a decline during the sonar exposure and a slow increase after the sonar comes back. So this kind of monitoring allows one to get a sense of the precise responses of animals during real exercises. So you contrast an experiment to prove that it's the sound that causes the response, and then monitoring that's realistic to try to get an idea of how the animals respond in realistic settings. And that monitoring effort allowed the Navy group to estimate the probability of disturbance just from sonar as a function of the received level of the sonar pings, with about a 50% response at about 145 to 150 decibels, but a relatively strong tail there at lower exposure levels. However, if we look at the small number of experiments we did, there seems to be a bifurcation. So there were 3 responses observed below 107 decibels, when the signal was just above the ambient noise. And you had to go 20 dB above for any other responses. And that suggests that the population is not uniform and that some are more sensitive than others. The evidence that animals respond at very low levels also came out from animals that were satellite tagged during actual sonar exercises. This data showed, if you look at the increase in inter deep dive interval on the figure on the right, you can see that it starts at about 100 kilometers. So satellite tagged whales delayed their dives when around 100 kilometers from the sonar exercises. And these results, that there's a subset of animals quite sensitive, led the Navy to develop a biphasic response function that's now used to try to predict the effect of sonar, which has a big shoulder on the left, because there's about 10 or 20% of the animals that basically show a strong response as soon as they detect the signal. This kind of information is really important for environmental risk assessment, where you identify the hazard, like Alexandros Francis detected dead whales on the beach. You look at where the hazards are, like where sonar is being operated. You look at where the animals are, which was available from the hydrophone array. You use the dose response function to predict the impact. And this information is how typically NATO navies will assess the impact of sonar now to try to eliminate the risk of killing beaked whales because of their activities. I would now like to back out from this adding sound and the short-term view to discuss briefly the current efforts on effects of anthropogenic sound focus on ocean soundscapes that we really need in each critical ecological region to characterize the primary sound sources. We need to model the propagation in the area, validate noise maps with ocean observation systems. We need to study, with the kind of study I just described, the effects of sound on marine life, but it would be great if we could broaden the scale to regional ecosystem and longer term experiments. And we need to observe ocean sound. We need to develop standards and more calibrated noise measurements. This has been taken on by the Global Ocean Observing System. Ocean sound has been added as an essential ocean variable that needs to be measured to understand the health of the ocean. And industry and regulators need to integrate and apply those results to manage the risk by defining the harm thresholds that are acceptable within each society and developing methods to monitor noise and their effects within their regulatory regimes. So just to give an example of the soundscape perspective, the things that drive changes in ocean sound may be geology, that's like the tectonics, ocean processes, the changes in the temperature and salinity of the ocean will affect propagation, climate will affect it, changes in the ecosystem. And that may change the distribution of sound sources, like whales, like fish, human sources of sound, sonar, shipping, seismic air guns, and the natural abiological sounds or abiotic sounds like ice, wind, and earthquakes. And those lead to these geophysical, anthropogenic, or biological components of the soundscape. We can use these elements of the soundscape to infer what's going on with the elements, like how much ice is there, how much does wind change, or how much anthropogenic stressors are there, and what are the impacts on biology. So the soundscape perspective is quite important for this broader scale perspective. And the example I'd like to give here, which is just off Africa, is that some African soundscapes are really dominated by sounds of human activities. And this is a comparison of the soundscapes in the Atlantic Ocean from the far north Arctic in Fram Strait down to the Antarctic in Bransfield Strait and Ascension Island, which is off the west coast of Africa in deep water. Long-term spectrograms, so they show the intensity of sound as a function of frequency on the y-axis and months of time on the x-axis, show a lot of blue in the Arctic and Antarctic, not so much blue in Ascension Island. What that is from is that there's more noise in Ascension than in either of the other sites. The red, vertical red stripes that are temporary are things like storms that may blow through any site and will temporarily increase the noise. And you can see the storms have a seasonal pattern that's different in the northern hemisphere from the southern hemisphere, and pretty consistent through Ascension. if you look at the daily median sound levels across this frequency region, you can see they're seasonally high on the right in polar regions, but quite high all year round at Ascension. The ambient levels over this band are around 110 dB. So remember, with the beaked whales, that's quite high compared to the levels that beaked whales were actually responding to. And when people dove into these measurements and recorded the sound sources, the clear difference in these sites was that air guns used for seismic survey were detected nearly every hour over the entire period in Ascension Island. The west coast of Africa is an important area for oil exploration, and there were scarcely an hour during the time period of these recordings when whatever was living there wouldn't have been affected by and hearing the sounds of air guns used for seismic survey. In the Arctic, there are surveys going on in the summertime, the northern summer, and there were a few surveys detected in the austral summer, but much less and much more seasonal in the two polar regions. And it's the Ascension equatorial region that was really continuously dominated. And what we need to think about from this is, now that we know what the soundscape was like in the middle, is what are the relevant listeners in this area that might be affected by it? What are the other sources that might be affecting them? How close are they to these sound sources? How is it changing over time, and what might the impacts be? This is something which I think is really important for this area, to understand the impacts of quite an intense anthropogenic sound source. So with that, I'd like to stop and save a little bit of time for questions. I hope that my adventure through both broad time and spatial scales, sort of ecosystem perspectives, and then narrowing into quite narrow experiments to demonstrate that sound causes effects, gives you a sense of the range of things we need to do to understand the impacts of sound. We need to demonstrate that sound causes effects for most regulators to act, but we need to put that knowledge in an ecosystem long-term setting in order to really protect our ecosystems from the negative impacts of anthropogenic sounds. Thanks so much.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for your talk. That was incredibly fascinating. I know I learned quite a lot about how noise actually affects animals in the ocean, a few stuff that I had no idea about. So thank you so much for that. We do have time for a few questions. Does anybody have a question? Simon Elwin, go for it.
Hi, Peter. Simon Elwin here from Sea Search. Thanks for that great overview. And I think you did a really nice job of portraying the underwater world to many of our terrestrial colleagues. I feel like we're in a place where we know the answer. We know that noise is impacting so much marine life. In your experience, is this being taken on by regulators, by shipbuilders to proactively reduce noise? Have you seen any progress in that sector at the high level?
Shipping is a very interesting example. So I gave an example of navies that have sort of been forced by regulations to modify how they train. I think that is a success story, at least for the NATO navies. Shipping, there are several companies that have taken a close look at this, and the International Maritime Organization has taken it quite seriously as well. So Maersk, which is one of the largest of the shipping companies, was concerned both about effects of noise and effects about carbon pollution from shipping. And their typical operating pattern 10 years ago was they would rush from a port where they loaded to the port where they would unload, and they'd sit and wait until they could get a slot. And they realized that if they knew when the slot would be available as they left, they could slow down and both reduce their emissions and the noise as they went by. Now, there's a trade-off. The slower you go, the longer your exposure might be, and the quieter your ship is. So you need to think about the overall impact. But there's an example of a company sort of thinking carefully through ways to reduce the impact that don't particularly affect their business model. It's just a smarter way to do things. There also are ways to quieten ships And that's one of the areas the IMO has been looking at. But ships have a long time period. This is like climate change issues with power supply. We need to start making these changes today in order for an impact to accumulate over decades so that we reduce the impact. Making rapid changes is really difficult on a global scale.
Yes, a question here in the front.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much. I actually wanted to ask, what do you think about the idea of lowering the sound of ships, but then also finding that balance between making sure the whales are still able to get out of the way from ship strikes? So I know there is a system being designed in Sweden called the pressure Porzo system, and that allows the propellers to be almost entirely silent of the vessels that use them. However, the increase in ship strikes might then be something we might see with that. What would you have to say about that?
Yeah, this is a really complicated question. The propulsion for a ship comes from the stern, and the risk of collision is on the bow. And often the hull of the ship reduces the radiation of sound straight in front of the ship. So most of the sort of deleterious noise is going off in directions that aren't that helpful to warn whales. We did some experiments with northern right whales where the population is really threatened by injuries from entanglement in fishing gear and vessel collision. And we thought, because of this problem of the shipping propulsion noise not being a very good warning signal, we developed higher frequency warning signals that were directional right in front of the ship. And it would be something the animal would only hear when it was within, a kilometer or so range, which would be sort of the range at which it should start doing an avoidance response. Unfortunately, what right whales did when they heard the alarm was they came right up to the surface and moved along the surface, which actually increased the risk of collision from sort of a vertical avoidance perspective. So I think that it's very important to consider what are the best ways to alert whales to the presence of fast-moving ships. And I don't think that it's been completely resolved, but I don't think that the loud propulsion noise is a great solution for that problem. It's also just something that's so overwhelming in heavy shipping areas. If whales were avoiding every time they heard individual ships, they'd never get anything done. So this is something that I think needs further work, but we can't assume that producing a directional signal in front of the ship is helpful. It could actually pose a big risk. So the solutions in areas where I'm aware that this is a particularly significant problem, the solutions people have been coming up with are forcing ships to slow down.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we have a few online questions. Oh, wait, let's do Collins first. Thanks.
Thank you. Ships, for navigation purposes, use high-frequency sonar, say like at 200 kilohertz. For purposes of science, in fish stock assessment, we also use high-frequency sonar ranging from 30 kilohertz to 200 kilohertz or even more. What are your thoughts about this? Would this be too intrusive to fish? Thank you.
That's a really great question. There are some, as I mentioned, most fish are not sensitive to sound above about 1 kilohertz. There are some fish that are specialists for high frequency hearing. They have things like gas-filled swim bladders that when they are impacted by high frequency sound, they will vibrate. And that has like a mechanical or air-filled connection to the ear sense, to the hearing organ. And some of those fish have specialized, we think, for detecting the sounds, the echolocation sounds of toothed whales. So animals like shad and some herring, they aren't incredibly sensitive to those sounds, but they can actually detect echolocation sounds of dolphins and will swim away from them when they're within a few meters of an oncoming predator. So I do think that sounds within the sort of that hearing range up to about 120, 150 kilohertz are a potential impact. I don't know of any marine organism that hears much above 150 kilohertz. So I think your 200 plus kilohertz range is not a big deal. There have been studies on the impact of precision scientific echo sounders operating at about 30 kilohertz, and they definitely affect beaked whales. So that is something to be concerned about. And, as scientists, we always have to be concerned about how our measurement tool is affecting our animals. It may not only pose a risk to them, but it may bias our science results.
Okay, thank you so much. Peter, you do have a few questions online, so if you could take the time to answer them on the Hoover app. But we don't have any time for questions anymore, so I'm going to end the session here. Thank you so much for being here with us, Peter. Your talk was fascinating once again, and we will see you guys back here at 2:45. Thank you.
My pleasure. I wish I could have been there.